So hi everyone, it's really great to be here. I just want to start out by saying thank you to all the people who helped organize this. So Denise and Paula and Lori and Andrea for all the logistics. Thank you very much. It was very easy I just had to show up basically. So, and that's not always the case when you're giving talks. So today, it's interesting that you talked about this in the beginning about liminal spaces, because I'm going to be talking a little bit about that today in this presentation in kind of um, marginal way, but it's related. So the talk I'm going to be giving today is about how in the process of doing our qualitative research, critical qualitative research, in a faculty of health or in places where in liminal places where it's not always acceptable, what happens when we're trying to actually publish our work or to present our work, or what's happening in this process of beginning our research process all the way to the publication stage. So it's going to be very related to what you said about working in liminal spaces. Because while we're working in liminal spaces, it's also very, very, very important that you are able, especially those who are interested in academic careers, that you're able to understand the rhetoric of the disciplines in which you're working and how to present your work so that people can hear you. Okay, so this space, these liminal spaces, which is fantastic, and I was just saying that where I come from, there are no spaces like this. Okay, so there are very few people who are doing qualitative research, very few people who are critical to begin with. But this is a haven. This is an amazing place, and I urge you to come to the monthly seminars, to as many things as happening, because it's very rare. Okay, so even in the conferences that you go to, there are little spaces. You know, Lori and I go to APA sometimes. We have to find our little enclaves. But this is amazing what you have going on here. So appreciate it, first of all, because it's very rare. But also recognize that if you're looking at academic careers or you're looking at dissertation committees who may not speak this language, you have to find ways to publish, to speak, to present, that people can hear you. Okay, so just in terms of, what is a critical qualitative health researcher research, okay? So I just wanted to give a little introduction to myself, and then also before I even start today, to actually hear what you guys are doing, you women are doing, actually, and to hear a little bit of what stage you're at and what experience you have with qualitative research. It's going to help me frame the talk a little bit. But in terms of critical qualitative health research, I have a range of research interests. The main one is working in the field of psycho-oncology, working with healthcare workers. And part of the thing that I'm interested in looking at is how healthcare workers deal with the emotional stresses of their work. So turning kind of the lens onto the healthcare worker, to people who have power, and speaking to them in a different way about places where they find or experience vulnerability. Just people here are already interested in this topic. I can see right the reaction. Other kinds of topics that I work on are the psychosocial issues associated with cancer, the cancer trajectory, diagnosis, and treatment. Grief and loss research. So our latest project is looking at how healthcare workers identify suicide risk in cancer patients, ethnic minorities' access to mental health who have cancer, single parents whose children have cancer. I can sort of go on and on, but I'm just showing you some of the different projects that I've worked on, so you have a sense of the broad scope of what a critical qualitative health researcher looks at. And very much I'm interested in the psychological aspect. I am a psychologist, but I'm also interested in systems and how the individual, let's say, healthcare workers operating within power dynamics. And so we're always looking at kind of both angles of this in the research. So the presentation today, as I mentioned, is called The Bits on the Cutting Room Floor, Erasures and Denials within the Qualitative Research Trajectory. So, if you were just going to look at the abstract, it's about what's left off in the process of publishing our projects and in the process of doing our projects. But it's actually a lot more than that, okay? So when we're talking about the theoretical orientations underlying positivistic research, qualitative and quantitative paradigms are very, very, very different. And so this project actually started out by thinking about what are kind of the philosophical orientations behind the different methods that we're using. And what happens when I'm coming from a qualitative research paradigm that ontologically, the very purpose of the research is different than a positivistic project. What happens when I'm in a positivistic field and I have to now publish and translate my work that's, again, ontologically, fundamentally different in its orientation for an audience that doesn't necessarily understand what those foundations are? So this paper is published, it's in a German journal actually called Psychotherapy and Social Sciences, although the paper is published in English. So if did we send the paper around, Andrea? I can't remember. So if anyone's interested in the full paper, you can just email me and I can send it to you because it is published and I'm only going to get through parts of it today. Okay, so some background. I mentioned how this started. And most of my research is qualitative in orientation, but in recent years I've moved from predominantly qualitative research into mixed methods because I started to understand this shift is often made, or it's made the other way. So you start with a quantitative project and then you feel, in your spirit, in your heart, that there's this thing that you really want to find out that you're just not accessing using the quantitative methods. And so sometimes there's an add-on to the end of the project that's qualitative. I sort of moved in the other direction. I started with predominantly qualitative research and I moved more into mixed methods because the kinds of questions I was asking were not being answered solely by qualitative methods. But in recent years, before I moved into this mixed method, I was doing a series of projects on oncologist experiences of patient death. Okay? And I started this project because my own mom was sick with breast cancer from the time I was 9 years old, and she died from the disease when I was 25. And we had these very long-term relationships with the healthcare workers who had known me since I was a little girl, and then it just stopped. Right? So we were going to the hospital for many, many years with my mom. We were with her through the whole treatment trajectory. We were very close to the nurses, to the primary oncologist. And then all of a sudden, all of that just got cut off. And I started to think about that. I started to think about, what is happening? I knew what was happening for me and my family in terms of those relationships that we had formed with the healthcare team. But I started thinking about what was actually happening for the healthcare workers from their perspective. Because they have lots of long-term relationships with patients that they develop attachments to, not only to the patients, but also to the patients' families, like in my case, where you're a very small child and you're actually growing up, and they're seeing you grow up. So what was happening there? And that precipitated a series of studies on this topic that actually had never been researched before, which was both surprising and not surprising, and we're going to talk about why it wasn't surprising in a moment. This is sort of the area I got into. Now, the problem I ran into was not the actual research. Okay, so the research went really, really, really well. But the problem I encountered was publishing. Okay, so now I actually wanted to publish this research not in a social science journal, and not in a nursing journal, and not in a journal that I knew that would accept qualitative research. I wanted to publish it in a medical journal. I wanted to publish it for the oncologist because the research was about them and it had profound implications for treatment of patients and families. And I'll talk a little bit about the findings, although we're going to focus more on the methods. But there was serious conflict in terms of the methodology and the things I was talking about and the expectation of the medical journals that I wanted to publish in. Okay, and so I realized that many things were happening in the process of writing this up. So I realized a few things while I was trying to get these papers in. The first was we often have this debate about qualitative versus quantitative. Okay, we even have it from the qualitative side of things. Which is the better method, right? We debate about this and we talk about it, and we're just as elitist about this as the quantitative people are. I think that we can be just as critical and dismissive of quantitative research as quantitative researchers are of qualitative researchers. And I realized immediately that that was the wrong question. Okay, it wasn't about qualitative or quantitative. It was about the paradigms in which we're doing our research and what we were trying to get across in the process of doing the research and in the publication of it. And the second thing was what I began to talk about in the introduction, that there were actually fundamental ontological differences in the quantitative and qualitative paradigms, and that we had to start addressing some of this when we were thinking about methodology and publishing our work. So I'll explain. So it's not just that we're using different methods. They start from different epistemological and ontological foundations. So without getting this into too deeply, within a quantitative paradigm, when we talk about relationships and emotion and reflexivity, those things in a quantitative paradigm are considered what? Bias. What else?
Noise.
Variables.
Noise.
Right? What else?
Undesirable.
Undesirable, right? So they're noise. They're things that we want to take out of our research. We're trying to build our projects from the get-go, our research design, so that we are removing those things from our projects. But in the qualitative paradigm, it's the exact opposite, right? Ontologically, the way we're doing the research from the get-go is different. We're saying emotion is very important. We're saying the relationship between the researcher and the research, the participant or the informant, even think about the language that we're using, is important. It's not noise. It's the opposite of noise. It's actually our findings, right? I mean, it's very, very, very important to address those things. Those are the meat of our, I'm a vegetarian, so I'm going to say the tofu of our work. So already from the start, there are very, very different approaches, and the method, the qualitative method, gives us these tools in order to ensure that we are including relationships and affect and emotions and the noise into our work, right? So again, I don't know what the level of experience here is in the room. So if some of this is too simplistic or you already know it, then this is just a refresher. And for those who don't, this is a little bit, maybe a little bit new. But memos, for example. So what are we doing when we're doing memos? What is the purpose of a memo? What is a memo? What's a memo?
It's like a note to yourself.
Okay, exactly. So it's a note to yourself in the course of your research. And what are we trying to write in the memos? What goes into a memo? Ideas about the data. So for example, you may notice somebody's body language, okay, that you may write in a memo. You may notice an emotional reaction that you're having to somebody in the interview process. You might notice even, some of the things that go into my memos are even some of the physical things that are happening. So for example, when I was interviewing oncologists in Israel, which is a very different culture than it is here, one of the things I noticed, and it was a very long memo that actually became integrated into the data, was that the door kept flinging open every 3 seconds. There was no privacy, there were no boundaries, there was no, things were ringing, the thing was beeping, they were answering the phones, they were talking to their kids, they were talking to their doctors, other doctors, they were talking to their patients. All of this was happening while the interview was going on. Now that is very hard to transcribe into a transcript, but it can go into a memo. And the point of the memos, all of these things that you're putting into the memos, is that we're trying to figure out what are kind of some of the unspoken, interpersonal, dynamic things that are happening in the interview process that aren't necessarily going to be transcribed in the transcript, but that are really important to the data. Okay, and one of the primary things that we're talking about is the emotional aspects of doing the research. That we actually, part of the reason we do that too, somebody mentioned bias before, right? So one of the kind of theories of qualitative research and memos of reflexivity is that we are trying to explicate our own biases through writing these memos by making them conscious. Whereas in a quantitative project, there's kind of here I'm going to be critical again, embodying the very things that I'm telling you that we do, but I think it's true that by the very process of designing a quantitative project, when I'm picking a set of measures and I'm saying there's no bias, there's no noise, there's no this, I'm in a way hiding or concealing some of my biases, because already from the get-go I've chosen this survey and not this survey. I'm already making choices, right, that are reflective of my biases. So with these memos, we're saying, well, we actually want to become very aware of them. Okay? And so a lot of it is about the emotional aspects. This relates to reflexivity and horizons of understanding. So reflexivity and horizons of understanding, sometimes called bracketing. So lots of different theories have different names for this. Okay, so Gadamir and my mentor David Rennie called it a horizon of understanding. Other people call it bracketing. Essentially, this is the process of making public in our publications, in our dissertations, in our conference presentations, the biases that we have been so busy uncovering during the whole process of the research and writing in our memos. Okay? How many people here read qualitative research papers? Okay. How many of you ever read a horizon of understanding or a reflexive section?
Once in a while.
What?
Yeah.
Okay, once in a while. Okay. Usually it's 2 or 3 sentences that says, I'm a white woman growing up in blah, 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 and it ends there. Okay, as if somehow that you just identify your positionality is enough to really get into the complexity of how your perspective is influencing your research and your data. It's not enough. You know, often when I'm doing the reviews, I say it's not enough to simply say who you are. You have to explain how these things are actually affecting your research and the way you analyze the data. So these are the biases that are could be historical, cultural, geographical. They're supposed to be part of the report. Okay, they're supposed to be an important part of the final report, whatever that final report is. Okay, we're supposed to acknowledge emotions and relationships. Okay, so we recognize in qualitative research that the relationship that we have with our participants is integral to the kind of data we're producing. Right? And it's integral to the way we're presenting our data. So all of this emotional stuff that's coming up in the process when you're researching grief, or when you're researching diabetes, or when you're researching global health, okay, and some of the things that women are experiencing. These are emotional topics, okay? It comes up. They, by virtue of their human dimensions, they elicit affect. And that is supposed to be part of what we're writing up. We're supposed to be writing up in a voice that's effective, okay? That's emotional. Okay, so we're supposed to be doing all of these things, and we claim that we do these things as qualitative researchers, but what actually ends up happening, I think the irony of this is that most often all of these things that make qualitative research the unique method that it is, that differentiates it from positivistic or quantitative research, gets left off, gets left out. Okay? And as I was thinking about what gets left on the cutting room floor, I realized that there was actually a taxonomy that I was developing, that there were a couple layers of this. And this is how I kind of divided this up, and I said, okay, off the record are all the aspects that the researchers are aware of, but which never make it outside of the researcher's head. I'm going to give you examples of this. And I just have to say one thing here. It's very, very hard to document what's invisible, right? So this was difficult to think about because I realized and I felt intuitively as I was doing my projects and I was writing it up, that things were being dropped, you know, at all levels of doing the research. But it was very hard to document what it was that was being dropped. And actually, the off the record, this was easier to document because this was sort of things that I was aware that I was doing that I wasn't including. So I'm going to get into more detail into each of these things, but just to give you a small example now, you know, if I'm writing up my paper and I know that I'm writing it up for Archives of Internal Medicine, which is where the first paper went, I know that if I talk too much about the emotional reactions that I had, or if I mention too much some of the biases that I had that I was realizing that I was doing, that this paper was not at all going to get published, and it wouldn't even go out for a review, let alone not get published. So already, you know, from the start, it's things that I'm aware of, but I choose not to include right from the get-go. Off the books are all the parts that begins in the initial record, but that eventually gets cut out, okay, in the process of publication. So as an example, if you started with your paper as being a, you know, I don't know, let's say 8,000, how many words are a social science paper is now? 8,000?
Max. 5,000.
5,000, okay. Still, that seems like so many words. Okay. If you started off with a publication, Did you want
I was just saying that in social science,
Yeah.
we still publish 5,000, 8,000.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so
In social science,
Yeah.
in health science, we are
5,000.
5,000 under.
Exactly. So I'm also publishing in health sciences. So 5,000, 8,000. You start with these gorgeous papers. I mean, they're just beautiful works of art, right? You're so proud to get to the end. You're like, that included everything. This looks so good. All these rich quotations, and then you try to publish in a discipline that you want to publish in, and you realize that you have 5,000 words or 3,000. In my case, it ended up being 1,500 words. Okay, so a lot got cut off the record. Okay, but what's important here is that this was already this was documented, okay? There was an initial record that included all of this that got cut. And this one is the most difficult, I think, but it happens all the time, okay? I called it off the charts. It's the parts in the research process that we sense or we feel or we intuit or something is going on in the interview or in the dynamic, but that they're not actually reaching consciousness. Okay, and I'm going to give you several examples of this. So it's almost that intuitive feel that you get about, let me give you an example of this, okay, right now. So, sometimes you're doing your interviews. Has anybody done interviews out of the doctoral students? Okay, so we know that the interview guide is flexible, it's fluid, right? So you have a certain set of questions that you want to ask, but it's possible that additional questions are going to arise during the process because of somebody said something, it seems important, you want to probe more. How many times has it happened to you? It's happened to me many, many, many times, where I ask a question that no one cued me to the fact that I should ask this question, but I just felt that this was the direction I needed to go in terms of the questioning. Has that happened? Right. So, but what is that? What is that? What is going on there in that interaction? So the participant isn't actually mentioning it or isn't actually saying it. Okay, there's no explicit cue about what this question is. But somehow we sense or we feel that this is important. This is a direction that we want to ask about. Now, something is happening there, right? There's the intersubjective exchange, there's a relational dynamic. It's sort of what happens in therapy, too, okay, between a therapist and a client, where the therapist uses their intuitive sense to sort of understand and to feel what's happening with the client and to ask questions. But this is also happening in the research trajectory, and we don't ever talk about it. We don't ever talk about how we know the things that we know. And so I called it off the charts because it's happening. We're not fully aware that it's happening, and sometimes it's so weird that we don't know what to do with it. Okay, and I'm going to give you several examples from my own work and also published that people have talked about what happens in their own work. Okay, so let's start. Okay, so I said this is what happens when the researcher is aware of it, but it never sort of moves beyond the head of the researcher. It never gets to the pen, okay, to the paper. It's the invisible data of the project that never sees the light of day because maybe it's just beyond the researcher's awareness, or they just feel this is not something that should be included in the publication. So I'll give you some examples. In my own work, I mentioned on the grief of oncologists, literally off the record. Okay, so are all the things that participants say to you when you turn off the tape. Okay, so annoying. Really important pieces of data. Really, really, really important pieces of information. So, for example, in my own study, oncologists who would say, sometimes talk about alcoholism, talk about mental health issues, talk about extreme difficulty with the emotional aspects of their work that they didn't want to be on the record. I mean, they were aware of what they were doing. They waited for the tape to come off in order to kind of reveal some of these things. And this has to do with, this is part of the findings of the research, which is that showing emotion in a medical setting as an oncologist is considered a vulnerability, even a liability. It's something that other people consider as weakness. I mean, the ironic thing about this, and again, this could also be something that ends up being off the record, is that most of the participants are saying the same thing, and they're so isolated. Everybody else feels like everybody else sees this as a vulnerability and a weakness, And yet, this is a very common experience among the oncologists. But here we had many things that were said once the tape was turned off. Now, what do you do with that data? It cannot become part of the published record. Okay? You have no audit trail for it. It's not part of your transcripts. You can put it in the memos and maybe mention it. But it's a very tricky thing to do with your data, because what are you going to do with that if somebody says, this, for many, many, many qualitative researchers who are in the process of publishing their work, many things are left off. And this is just one example of it. There are other examples of what's left off the record. Another example I just wrote for myself here is, other things where, and you can find creative ways of presenting it so that it doesn't cause harm to your participants. Places in the interview where people say things about their colleagues, for example, or places in the interview where there are long pauses and people are concerned, this happened in my own research, where people are concerned about whether other colleagues are going to know what they said. Okay, so these are kind of like the interpersonal quirks, the human quirks that we all have, that we step out of our professional personas for a moment and we say things that maybe we wish we hadn't said in a recorded interview. So how do you negotiate those things? How do you include them on the record, if at all? I chose not to include them on the record. But I think it's very interesting to hear how other people negotiate some of these things that do or do not stay on the record. We will come back to this. Off the books. So what remains off the books are all the parts of the qualitative research process that were initially included in the record, but then taken off in the process of publication. And I think that there's a lot of examples of this, especially in the health sciences, where we're so limited in our word counts. And it's a negotiation that starts even before you submit your paper. Okay, so you write out this long manuscript, you include all these quotations, you include your horizon of understanding, and then you understand that you've chosen this journal that only allows for 3,000 words. Okay, so now you have to cut your 8,000 word manuscript to 3,000 words, but then there's a whole new set of negotiations that happens, because once that paper is sent out for review, you get 3 or 4 or however many reviewers you get. They all have different demands about what they want included or taken out. It's a negotiation process with the editor as well, who also has her or his own demands. And so there are many new things that are included in the paper, and many things that you included that you thought were important that are taken out. And this too becomes, can become an ethical quandary about what you want, what is important for you to include and what you end up actually publishing. So this 8,000 word paper that I wrote ended up being 1,500 word paper with just one example. This happens many times throughout my career, and all the quotations moved to a table in the back. It was an online appendix. Okay, so now there's all this stuff about online appendices. So the quotations aren't even in the final report that people see in the journals. They're now online. Who's going to take the time to go online? I often wonder, does anybody actually download these appendices? Like, I have no idea, but I really hope that they do, because it's a very, very important part of the data, and I want them to see them. So this is a epistemological issue as well, because all the things that I mentioned in the beginning, what we said, the horizon of understanding, the reflexivity, the relationships, the affect, all of those things that are kind of the foundations of qualitative research are completely cut out in the process of trying to get your papers published in these specific domains. Now you can choose, of course, journals that allow for 8,000 words in which you can include all of that. But this goes back to the thing that you said in the beginning about the liminal spaces and which audiences do we want to talk to. So it's not only about, in my mind, the future tenure. This was before I had tenure when I published the paper, but it's not only about the future tenure committee that was in my mind that I was thinking about, this is a high impact journal, we need to publish here. And it's not only about the fact that, this has more prestige or less prestige. It's also that you want your research to reach the audience that the research is about. And so in order to do that, you have to speak their language. But to speak their language means that you're cutting a lot of the things that are important to you that were part of the research trajectory from the final report. Anybody have this experience? Examples from your own work about things? Do you want to give an example? So?
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I mean, I'm an anthropologist.
Yeah.
And my, especially in the discussion we were just having about the stuff that we don't include. Like,
Yeah.
My doctoral research involved almost 2 years of field work in a community in South Africa, so there's obviously a lot that I made ethical decisions about not putting it in. And the way that I reconcile this as much as I can in my work is to target multiple audiences at the same time. You
Yeah.
know, write in different vernaculars, speak to different silos of knowledge, hopefully in a way that does a little bit of the work of
Yeah.
bridging those silos to some degree, but it always falls short of, you know, where I would like to be with it.
Yeah, well, I think that's an incredible strategy, and it's one that I've used myself in my own career as well. Very good strategies to be able to speak to multiple audiences that are important to you, and that have different purposes. Okay, so it is also possible, and this is also an ethical issue that we deal with, that we may even be publishing in journals that are high-impact journals or the important journals in our field, because we feel that it's important for our careers, and not even because we want to reach that particular audience. Okay, we do that. Researchers do that, and they do that, and it's important to do that, even though there may be an ethical quandary with it, because we want to get academic careers, and we want to get hired, and we want to get tenure, and those are realistic. Precarious employment we were talking about earlier, right? About, you know, hard to find work where you could do the work that you want to do. Those are realities, okay, of the workplace that we're in and the fields that we have chosen. So the speaking in multiple voices and multiple audiences also has layers. Okay, we do it for different reasons, and I think that that's okay. Some people have different perspective of that. Okay, so just to say that off the books is a process that begins with the self-erasure, right? So when we take our document that's 9,000 words or 8,000 words, and we begin to already cut from the get-go to submit to a particular journal, that's the first erasure that we're doing to ourselves and to our work. And then there's a continual set of erasures that happens as the manuscript goes through to the publication stage. And you will see as you go through your careers that different journals have different requirements. But often it's also, as I said, a negotiation with reviewers. You know, that reviewer B that's always driving you crazy. Okay, so reviewer B often requires, it's always B, right? It's like they put the kind of like, they put positive and negative in the middle. Often requires you to include many, many things in the paper that you may not think are important at all. Okay, so okay, so what I was going to say here, this, I wish this was an exception that we do this self-erasures, but it's not. I was actually looking at, this is from 2011, a systematic review of qualitative articles reporting on an individual's experience of chronic back pain. And what these authors wanted to do was to have a look and see what was included in the methodology sections of these qualitative papers. And their conclusion was that many of the papers they reviewed had positivistic undertones, which may have shaped the reporting of the data. The authors include this as a limitation of their study, that a critique can only be made based on the article contents. So, but what they're saying is that many of the things that we say we do in qualitative research, we don't actually do when you look at published papers. Okay? And their conclusion is, we don't know if these studies and these papers are positivistic, or whether these things actually just got left out because of the publication process. But they were looking at a mass of articles on this particular topic to try to see how are qualitative researchers negotiating the publication of their papers in these journals that were accepting papers on chronic back pain. And this is a question that's important to think about. So is it that from the get-go we are taking a positivistic approach to our qualitative projects and leaving all of these things out in the conducting of the research? That would be very problematic if that were the case. Or is it, you know, what happened in the case that I described in my own example, which is that you do include all of those things in the process, but then are required through all of these hoops that you're jumping through to take it all out. So when I looked at my own self-erasures, I understood that I do come from this critical qualitative background, and I did do all of these things that we're supposed to do, and it was a very thorough study, and it had pages and pages of memos and horizon of understanding. But in the process of getting it out for the public, I had to cut most of it out. So if you looked at that paper, you would think I'm one of these positivistic qualitative researchers. And I had a lot of conflict about this when this was published. I really had a hard time, a really, really hard time. And it was a debate about whether to actually pull the paper and to go somewhere else or to go ahead and to publish it. And I decided to publish it for the reasons I mentioned. That one, it was the right audience. It was the audience I wanted to reach, and that was first and foremost most important. And secondly, a reality. It was a high-impact, important medical journal, and I needed that publication. Okay, so I agree with you that this is something that's happening, that we really, many people who are doing qualitative research are doing it with very positivistic approaches. But there's also this other thing that's happening in the process of writing it up. Okay, so off the charts, last one. So this is the most invisible type of erasure, I think. In this category are all the parts of the qualitative research process that are happening, but that, as I said, are not supposed to be happening, or are so kind of alien and bizarre that we think that they shouldn't be happening. And so we have a difficult time kind of understanding what's going on. So these might include moments of deep, maybe even inexplicable relational moments of connection with your participants. It could be instances where you know something about the participant, but the participant isn't actually saying it. Okay? It could be a moment of rage that you have towards your participants, that you don't even know why you're reacting so strongly to what they're saying. Okay, so these are experiences that are kind of beyond the scope of what we are expecting to happen in the interview. So for example, in this excellent book, I highly recommend, it's called Secrets and Silence in the Qualitative Research Process. It's a very long title. Feminist Reflections on Secrets and Silence in the Qualitative Research Trajectory, okay, by Routledge. A really great compilation of articles. This is one of the chapters, and she describes conducting research interviews with women where childhood sexual abuse is applied by the research participant in the interview, but not explicitly articulated. Okay, so she says, it remains unspoken, but a present narrative between the research and the research participant. The participants do not name the sexual abuse they hint at and say nothing further about it. So although Phoenix knows that this is part of her participant's story, she also knows not to push for more or not to ask explicitly about it. And she writes, she's so successful, was she, the participant, at signaling this, that it was clear to me as a researcher that this was not a site for encouraging further revelation or to attempt to engage in an open discussion. So this notion of mutual knowing between a research participant and a researcher is not something we often talk about, but it is very, very, very common in the clinical encounter. Okay, so I mentioned earlier therapist-client, in psychotherapy, in analysis, this notion of intersubjectivity or unconscious knowing something about the client is a very acceptable, has a long and rich history, a very robust theoretical literature on this. So if anybody's interested, there's lots you can read on this topic. And of course, it's going to be happening in the research interview as well, because you're speaking to somebody sometimes for 1 hour or 2 hours about emotional topics, and there is a rapport that builds. Right? I mean, sometimes you interview these people more than once and you're developing relationships. And so this idea of mutual knowing, or something that's kind of hinted at or felt at, it's the thing I mentioned earlier about knowing which question to ask or which direction to probe, even though there are no cues or explicit hints at it, is this thing of intersubjectivity. So these off-the-charts instances can include the reactions or responses of the interviewees that go beyond the here and now. Okay, so in analysis we say something that triggers you is something where you're responding very strongly or intensely, emotionally, that's not related to the here and now, it's there and then. Meaning something is going on that the participant is saying to you, It could even be in a presentation. You know, maybe I'm ticking somebody off here, the things that I'm saying, and you don't exactly know why it's so frustrating or why it's so annoying. That feels not related to the here and now, but is triggering something that may be some to do with your own unconscious stuff. Okay? So these strong, intense emotional reactions that don't seem related to what's happening in the present. So I'll give you an example also that came out of this book. So she's talking here about something else. Okay, so I mentioned earlier about the sexual abuse, that this kind of felt that this is happening and that both the participant and the researcher are kind of complicit in knowing that this thing is present in the room, but we're not touching it. That's an example. Here she's talking about rage, this intense rage. Has anybody ever had an experience of rage with your participant? No, you're very lucky because, you know, the more research you do and the more topics you start to look at, I mean, maybe in your work sometimes there's anger or something that people say some things that are very distressing. I had one experience of rage with an oncologist who said to me, we were talking about end-of-life communication. I do a lot of work on end-of-life and palliative care. And he said to me, you know, a man who has a factory and has a business, he needs to know that his life, you know, he's got a few more months to live because he has all of this stuff that he needs to kind of wrap up. But a woman who's just a housewife, you know, what does she need to know? Like, it's better for her not to know. And I wanted to strangle him, you know, and it's very difficult. It's extremely difficult in that moment to remind yourself that you're not here to judge your participant. You're here to try to understand them from their perspective and to kind of deal with all of that affect that's coming up. Okay, and even in the write-up, when we're critical researchers, we want to be critical of what people are saying, right? The interpretation that you were talking about. It's a critique, okay? You need to leave that critique in, but we don't want to, at least I don't want to, and I teach my students not to do this, that being critical is not the same as being judgmental, and it's not about hating your participant or experiencing so much rage. It's trying to understand, to critique, to offer alternatives, to offer context to why people talk the way that they talk. It's very hard to negotiate all of these things. So she says she was interviewing a manager, and she says the encounter with this manager was marked by moments of acute emotional intensity and strain, and led to the state of mind in me that was full of rage and bent on vengeance. Yet this desire for vengeance was masked from view, sanitized by the process of writing academically for publication. The effect was to make the affective register secret, and my state of mind a secretively held undercurrent, pulling some of the subsequent work with the data in a particular direction. Okay, and she did a lot of work in writing this 2 minutes. Okay, we're almost at the end. She did a lot of work after she finished her study trying to understand why she reacted so strongly, first of all, how it affected her data and her research, why this was causing such an intense reaction, and, you know, even all of the stuff that she had submerged herself, okay, in that encounter, because it was so threatening and so inappropriate and so out of context and out of place in the research interview that it required a lot of work. Okay. So, conclusion, because I have 2 minutes. So, let's see what I want to say in the 2 minutes. Okay, I'm just going to kind of repeat what I said in the beginning, which is these erasures are a part of the process of doing qualitative research and publishing qualitative research. There's a reality of the workplace that we live in. But there's also a conflict and a struggle here, and an irony, because the very things that we're removing, all of these examples that I gave you that we're removing, are supposed to be the central piece of our epistemological and ontological approach and our methodology. Okay, and so I've given you examples of how I've tried to negotiate some of these things. I think also for graduate students that are here, that we often don't have these discussions, right? We do have conversations about the liminal space and how precious and important these conversations are, so that we can have consciousness and awareness of the things that we're interested in, the power dynamics we're interested in. It's not just us isolated alone. There are other people who are interested, respect, and appreciate our work. But all of this that happens, which is not just me, it's many qualitative researchers who are trying to progress in their careers, who are trying to speak to specific audiences, are struggling with these things that are often, we don't have the skills. We were not taught the skills on how to negotiate this in the world that we're trying to publish in. And so I hope that this presentation at least is just going to raise some awareness about some of these struggles, and to also for you to recognize that you're not alone in this. Okay, this is something we're all struggling with. It doesn't stop in graduate school, because then you get to your first academic job, and then you have to get tenure, and then you have your next promotion, and the pressures to publish and to publish in specific places and to show your work doesn't end. Okay, and we can critically deconstruct what does it mean to show your work, because none of us in this room, I think, believe that publishing, in JAMA is an indication of your work, right? I certainly don't. But there's also the reality of the workplace and the expectations. So, I hope that this is going to spark discussion. Do we have time for
Yeah.
for
So
conversation?
I know it's sparking discussion.
Great.
Thank you.